Bueno, buenos días y buenas tardes, mejor a todos y a todas. Y gracias por estar con nosotros y nosotras hoy en el seminario del Departamento de Ciencias Biológicas de la Universidad de los Andes. Eh, Hoy tenemos como invitado a Jay Falk. Jay Falk, ahorita vamos a hacer la presentación más formal, pero nos va a hablar hoy de un tema que suena fascinante, que es de las hembras que se parecen a los machos con un modelo de estudio que son los colibríes. Entonces, pues aprovechamos esta vez, estamos con Felipe, que es uno de los estudiantes del seminario y quien ha trabajado con Jay y hoy lo va a presentar. Entonces, Felipe, gracias por estar con nosotros y haber invitado a Jay. And Jay, thanks for being with us. We're delighted to hear about your research.
Bien, gracias, profe. Hola a todos. Pues Jay es biólogo de la Universidad de Texas. Él realizó su doctorado en la Universidad de Cornell y ahorita está empezando un postdoc en la Universidad de Washington en Seattle. Sus intereses son afines a la evolución de la variación que hay entre hembras y machos y entre cada uno y dentro de cada uno de los sexos. Y pues para nosotros es muy grato tenerlo aquí porque pues nos va a mostrar una investigación súper interesante que hizo para su doctorado. So, Jay, thanks for being here in today's seminar. We're glad to have you here in today's talk, and we know it's going to be awesome. So, if you're ready, let's begin.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for having me. Just a quick check. You guys can hear me okay and see this all right? I think. Okay. No indication that that's not happening. So yes. Okay.
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So as Felipe was saying, I'm currently a postdoc at the University of Washington, working for Alejandro Rico Guevara, where I'm continuing to study hummingbirds. But the project that I want to talk about today was work that I did during my PhD as a part of Mike Webster and Dustin Rubenstein's lab at Cornell University. So when we look across the amazing diversity in animal forms, what often pops out are cases of what we call exaggerated traits. And the dominant explanation in evolutionary biology is that these types of traits can result from competition for mates, or what we call sexual selection. Now, this quote from Darwin about how peacocks made him sick is pretty much a cliche if you study evolution. But I wanted to start with this because it's probably one of the reasons we think of peacocks as the classic example of sexual selection. And of course, Darwin would later propose his theory of sexual selection to resolve his issues with peacock feathers. But something that a lot of people don't know is the role of a single bird on Darwin's thought process while he was trying to come up with sexual selection. The entire idea of secondary sexual traits comes directly from documentation and study of this female peahen that lived a century before Darwin was born. The peahen had your typical drab female plumage for most of her life, but then at some point she molted into completely male-like plumage, with the full brilliant tail feathers and everything, which is illustrated here. And the reason I think this is notable is that observations of female ornamentation like this one have repeatedly had profound impacts on our understanding of the evolution of exaggerated traits. But at the same time, female ornamentation has historically been cast aside as an anomaly or maybe just a byproduct of similar patterns or ornamentation in males. And I think this is worth bearing in mind because more recently, the field of evolutionary biology has started to shift from looking at exaggerated traits just in males to looking at those traits in females and males as a whole. When we do so, we find that the sexual selection hypothesis is actually somewhat limited. And there are so many examples of animals, such as the ones depicted here, that don't follow its expectations. Now, the antidote to me is what we call social selection theory. Social selection theory, which was proposed by Mary Jane West Eberhard, broadens the scope for how competition can lead to exaggerated traits beyond just competition for males. Under this framework, West Eberhard argued that many types of competition can actually lead to ornamentation and trait exaggeration. Under her theory, sexual selection is just one type of social selection that involves competition for opportunity to mate. Other types of competition, such as for social rank, for food, or for breeding territories, can also lead to ornamentation, such as in the species on the right side of this figure. And I think the social framework is powerful because it looks at trait evolution from a broad and holistic perspective. But it can also be hard to study. Social selection forces us to challenge assumptions about what animals compete for and what limits that availability. And of course, there are many ways to answer that question for any given species at any given time. So how can we separate those threads to understand a complex system? Now, this is where I'll bring in hummingbirds, because hummingbirds are classic examples of extravagant ornamentation. But there's a lot we don't understand. In hummingbirds, females take on all parental care. So theoretically, it makes sense for us to expect lots of ornamentation in males. But plenty of hummingbirds have ornamented females, and even more intriguingly, what I'm talking about today. In many species, a proportion of females have some degree of quote-unquote male-like plumage coloration. In fact, in a study led by Ellie Diamant, we went through thousands of hummingbird specimens and found that out of species with sufficient data, nearly a quarter of them had this type of female polymorphism. So I decided to study one of these species, the white-necked Jacobin, shown here with a male on the left side and a female on the right. When we started this project, we knew male-like females probably existed in this species, but not much else. We didn't know the frequency of the male-like females, how similar they were to males, or even whether this was truly a polymorphism with distinct types. The research I'm presenting here was done in the town of Gamboa, Panama, through the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. So one of the first things we started doing was to monitor the population of white-necked Jacobins in Gamboa. Throughout the project, we processed over 400 individuals, banding them, taking photographs, and taking blood samples for genetic sexing. Our first step was to describe and observe plumage coloration. I won't go into too much detail, but just to summarize, we used a method which extracted 9 color values from each individual and analyzed them using a principal components analysis. Here I'm showing the first 2 principal components, which make up most of the variation in coloration. So this is basically a sort of visual representation of color variation in this species. Individuals that are close to each other are similar, and those that are far apart are more different. Females are represented as green circles and males as blue triangles. So you can see that color in this species is clearly divided into 2 distinct types. Notice that all males cluster together in the left side, but that females are present in both of these regions. We therefore refer to the color type on the left as male-like or androchrome, and the type on the right as drab or heterochrome. Overall, roughly 70% of the females were drab and 30% were male-like. Just to give you a closer look at this species, on the top row here, I have what male white-necked Jacobins look like, and on the bottom is what most females look like. And so you'll note some really distinct differences in especially the head coloration, throat coloration, and the tail are like opposite colors. Okay, so here I'm showing the male on the top again, but this time a male-like female on the bottom. So the difference between these female types is actually pretty dramatic, and the male-like females really are male-like, at least in their plumage. But there's still a missing piece to this puzzle. Since birds molt their plumage every year, maybe plumage color could be somewhat plastic, or it could change every time they molt. Or maybe that's not the case. Maybe individuals stay the same for their entire lives. To answer this question, we can use tiny lines on hummingbird bills called corrugations to estimate which individuals are juveniles. So all you need to know here is that more corrugation is associated with younger age. Okay, what I'm showing you here is a graph of the proportion of females in each plumage type at each corrugation level. Blue represents the male-like plumage and green represents drab. What we see here immediately is that younger individuals on the left side of the graph are entirely male-like, while older individuals are mostly drab. But you'll notice that no level of corrugation is entirely, You'll notice that no level of corrugation is entirely drab, which indicates that about 20% of the adult females also have male-like plumage. Okay, so to look at this another way, what we're seeing here is that both female and male juveniles start out in a plumage type similar to adult males. Most females then shift to the drab type as adults. As adults, but about a fifth of them stay in the male-like form. Now, just to emphasize, this is the complete opposite of what you see in most sexually dimorphic birds, where juveniles usually look more like the adult female. So far, our banding data also indicates that once Jacobins reach adulthood, they don't change their plumage type. Okay, one more thing to add. Over the years, we've collected video and photos of several male-like females sitting and tending to nests, which to us demonstrates that some male-like females really are reproductive. Okay, so besides being really unusual and intriguing, we can also use this ornamentation in this species to infer something about its adaptive value, or why it evolved. One possibility is that female ornamentation could have something to do with sexual selection. Basically, the sort of dominant theory, what I talked about in the beginning. In other words, specifically for this system, male-like ornamented female plumage is adaptive because it's favored by male mating preference. And if this were the case, one prediction we could make is that ornamentation in females is most prevalent during the reproductive life stage. But as I showed, what we found is the opposite. In fact, what we see in this species is that female ornamentation is most likely to show up precisely during the non-reproductive life stage and then is later lost as an adult. Since sexual selection can't act on individuals that are non-reproductive, it's unlikely that this is what female ornamentation is for. But you may be thinking, well, 20% of the adult females are still ornamented, so what about them? Also, sexual selection is all about mate preference. So, in this case, the mates are males, so what do males prefer? To answer this question, I did an experiment where I put two feeders next to each other in the wild, each with a taxidermy mount of a Jacobin. I had 3 different trial types, with each pairing combination of a male-like female, and a drab female. So the result is a trial type with different sex and different color, same sex but different color, and different sex but same color. I then watched the feeders and waited for hummingbirds to approach and interact. And when a Jacobin displayed either courtship or copulation behavior toward a mount, I recorded which they did this with first in each trial. So what did we end up finding? In trials with a male and a drab female, I found that in 100% of trials, Jacobins displayed courtship or copulation with the drab female first. In trials between a drab female and a male-like female, we see the exact same pattern, with 100% of Jacobins courting or copulating the drab female. And in trials where both male and female are the same male-like plumage type, we don't see any obvious preference. So it's clear based on this data that Jacobins court and copulate these mounts based on color, not genetic sex. And importantly, there's a strong preference for these drab females whenever they're present. So our second prediction for the sexual selection hypothesis also seems to be incorrect. With the findings so far, it's pretty difficult to see a way that sexual selection could benefit the male-like females. So if not sexual selection, then what else? I decided to go back to these questions I asked at the beginning of the presentation. What exactly do female hummingbirds compete for? And if you've ever had the opportunity to watch hummingbirds, you know they can be very aggressive with each other, especially around flowers or nectar resources. So I decided to do just that and watch who's chasing who around feeders. And if you haven't watched hummingbirds at feeders, here's a video kind of brutally demonstrating what I mean. Hummingbirds really just are not the friendliest of animals when it comes down to it. Okay, so just from watching who chases who in the wild, I came up with this graph. What I'm showing is a comparison between the number of chases in which each plumage type chased another bird versus the number of times that type itself was chased. So on the left side in green, I'm showing that male plumaged birds were more often chasers, which is in green, rather than the ones being chased, which is in blue. And on the right, drab females are rarely chasing other birds, but were often being chased. So to summarize, male-like individuals of unknown sex are more often aggressors, while drab females are more often being chased during aggressive interactions. So from those observations, I can propose an alternative hypothesis, that ornamentation in this species is a signal of competitive ability or aggression. Ornamentation in both males and male-like females could be associated with aggressive behavior and the ability to access and defend limited resources like food or nectar. So if this were the case, we might expect other hummingbirds to avoid aggressive interactions with males and male-like females in order to avoid provoking a dangerous competitor. So this is what I wanted to test next. Okay, to answer this question, I'll show some data from the same experiment with the paired taxidermy mounts. But this time, rather than sexual behaviors, I'll show you data on who the approaching birds decided to attack first rather than court first. Okay, so what did we find? Who do hummingbirds tend to attack? The percentages I'm showing here are the proportion of trials in which I saw an interacting hummingbird attack that mount type. Notice that when there's a drab female mount present, she tends to get attacked first, regardless of whether the alternative is a male or a male-like female. And between male-like females and males, we don't see much of a difference at all. So this shows that birds visiting feeders direct their attacks, again, based on color, not by genetic sex. And when drab females are present, they're usually the ones that get attacked first. So this sets up the potential that a benefit to being a female with ornamented plumage is that they are avoiding this type of aggression. Okay, before we move on, I want to make one more point. In the previous slide, I showed the results from any hummingbird that attacked the taxidermy mounts, whether it was a Jacobin or another species. But do we see the same pattern in non-Jacobin species? Okay, here I'm showing the same data as before, but this time with just non-Jacobins, no Jacobins. Overall, we found no significant differences between the way Jacobins and non-Jacobins behave towards mounts. Doing these sort of pairwise comparisons wasn't possible in two of the trial types, these two, because of low sample sizes. But you can see that the patterns are generally the same as what we've seen before. Non-Jacobins tend to attack the drab females first when they're present. Okay, I find this especially fascinating because it means that Jacobins are not the only ones paying attention to their coloration. Other hummingbird species could actually be playing a role in the evolution of female plumage in an entirely different species. Okay, so back to our hypothesis for a competitive ability signal. Our prediction is that other hummingbirds avoid aggressive interaction with males and male-like females. This turns out to be true. But now the question is, does that potential result in a real benefit? Okay, this is a really difficult question to answer because we can't tell the difference between males and male-like females in the wild. To get around this, we used an RFID monitoring system, radio frequency identification. Individual Jacobins were fitted with these tiny electronic tags When they visited feeders, we had equipped with an antenna. A data logger recorded the bird ID, the duration of its presence, and its location. So the problem, I'm illustrating it basically over here. With most birds, you would be able to put color bands on their legs, right? But as you can see, when hummingbirds perch, you just can't even see their legs. They're so small. I'm not sure if you can see it very well, but you can see this tiny little electronic tag underneath the skin of this hummingbird. It's about the size of a grain of rice. And on the right, this is one of the feeders with this circular antenna. When they feed, that antenna detects the tag and records the data. Okay, we set up a network of these feeders all over the town of Gamboa, with some of the feeders containing high sugar content and the others containing low sugar in order to kind of simulate variation in resource quality. Okay, so over 2 years, we were able to collect data from 155 birds and over 80,000 logged visits. Okay, so do male-like females actually have higher access to resources than drab females? We asked this in 3 different ways. First, the probability of visiting high versus low sugar feeders. Second, the feeder visitation rate. And third, mean visit duration. In case you're interested, all of these analyses use mixed effects models in order to account for random effects, such as the individual bird ID and the location of the feeder. Males were included in this analysis, but just for time's sake, I'm only presenting data from the females. Okay, first up, the probability of visiting high versus low sugar feeders. On the left side of the graph, you see the mean and confidence interval for drab females. And on the right, you can see the male-like females are pretty similar. Even though we don't see a difference between the females, in a separate analysis, we did find that higher sugar feeders were overall visited more often than lower sugar feeders. So this shows that they basically do have a preference for these high sugar feeders, but between the types of birds, between the males and females and male-like females and drab females, there's no difference in the probability of visiting high versus low. Okay, what about feeder visitation rate? We found in this analysis that there does seem to be a difference between the female types, with male-like females showing higher visitation rate than drab females. Just a word of caution for this result. This result is actually including days in which the birds were tagged, but we didn't detect them. So basically, those are like the 0 days when they they didn't feed at any of the feeders that we had. So when including those, that's when you see this result. If you don't include those days, you see the same trend, but it's not significant. So we think this is actually driven by presence versus absence rather than total sort of feeder visitation rate in general. It's just sort of hard to interpret these without considering all different types of frequency. Okay, so finally, we looked at the average duration of each feeder visit. And in this analysis, we included feeder sugar level as another variable. So the graph looks slightly different. On the x-axis, I'm showing high and low sugar feeders. And on the y, I'm showing the visit duration. Male-like females in blue do have overall longer visit duration, but this is most pronounced at the high sugar feeders. So the difference at the high sugar feeders is greater than at the low sugar feeders. And remember that these high sugar feeders are preferred by all Jacobins. So the male-like females are benefiting the most at feeders with high competition for access. Okay, so going back to our hypothesis that male-like ornamentation is a signal of competitive ability. It looks like there really is an associated benefit to accessing resources, especially when it comes to the frequency and duration of feeder visits. Now, you may be asking yourself, are male-like females and males both equally regressive? In other words, is this an honest signal of competitive ability? Okay, that's a great question, and it demonstrates that there are actually two possibilities that match what I've shown you so far. Okay, so one possibility is that this is an honest signal of competitive ability. In other words, ornamentation in males and male-like females is an honest indicator of aggressive behavior and the ability to access and defend limited resources. Again, consistent with what we've seen already. But we need to add another prediction to this, and that's that if this is true, males and male-like females should have higher resource holding potential than drab females, or competitive ability. It's just another word for resource holding potential. Now we can contrast the honest hypothesis with a sort of deceptive hypothesis. Here, ornamentation in males is an honest indicator of territoriality, but male-like females mimic males to avoid aggression and gain access to resources. Now, under this hypothesis, we would predict that males, but not male-like females, should have higher resource holding potential than drab females. Okay, and just to kind of clarify what we're looking for here is that under the honest signal of competitive ability, we expect that males and male-like females to have similar dominance capability than the drab females. But in the deceptive signal of competitive ability hypothesis, males, but not male-like females, should have higher dominance capability than drab females. Okay, so how exactly do you measure dominance capability or resource holding potential in hummingbirds? Okay, I'm going to be talking about two different measures that have historically been found to be associated with dominance capability in hummingbirds. The first one is muscle capacity. Muscle capacity is basically the ability, it's the capability of a bird to reach its maximum acceleration in mid-flight. And so the max acceleration is associated with ability to chase other birds away. And so therefore it's associated with competitive ability. Okay, now how do we measure this in hummingbirds? What you're watching here is, let's see if I can get this video to work. There we go. What you're watching here is a hummingbird in a small enclosure, and I've draped a string of weighted beads around its shoulders. The bird's instinct is to fly upwards towards the light that I put at the top, and as it does that, it's lifting an increasing amount of weight until it gets pulled back down again. The number of beads lifted is therefore a measurement of the bird's maximum muscle capacity. Let's see. Okay, so what did we find? I'm showing here the muscle capacity for each of the three types. And what you can see is that the two female types on the left are pretty similar, while the males have higher capacity than both types. And in fact, when you combine both female types, males have a mean 23% higher muscle capacity than the females. One thing. So for this, what I'm showing you here is total lift capacity. So that includes basically the amount that they lifted plus their own body weight. If you look at it another way by basically doing the amount that they lift per gram of their own body weight, because you might expect bigger individuals to be able to lift more, you actually see the same pattern with the males showing higher per gram lifting capacity. Okay. What about body size? In hummingbirds, we know that larger body size is also associated with dominance behaviors. And to look at this, I took several measurements that we took in the field, including mass, culmen, tarsus, tail, wing length, and wing width. And I compiled them using a principal components analysis. So again, what I'm showing here, I had the same kind of graph with color, but instead of color, I'm showing morphology. And in this case, the green region is associated with drab females, the blue region is associated with the male-like females, and gray is associated with males. And we're just looking at the adults here. Individuals that are closer, dots that are closer together, represent individuals that are close in morphology, whereas further apart means they're more different in terms of their morphology. Okay, so what you can see here is just visually, the two female types overlap, while the males are different and they're larger. And to look at this statistically, we generated randomized data sets to create null expectations for morphology. And we found that morphology cannot distinguish the two female types better than random. But males and females do differ in morphology when you combine the female types. So this graph only shows a total of, so because it's a principal components analysis, the total amount of variation displayed here is only about 65% of the variation. But this analysis included 100% of the variation. Okay, so muscle capacity and body size both seem to be saying the same thing. Female types are similar to each other, but males should have higher competitive ability, which is in line with the prediction of a deceptive signal rather than an honest signal. Remember, it was color, not sex, that dictated how other hummingbirds treated the mounts. But here we're seeing that sex, not color, dictates competitive ability. Okay, so after all these tests, I think this is where I'm at. To start, for some reason, males are more aggressive, and they have the morphology and specialization that adapts them to that lifestyle. Other hummingbirds, white-necked Jacobins, and other species recognize the male coloration and know that this plumage is associated with territoriality, and therefore they avoid aggression with males. Females, simply by looking like the males, also benefit in the same way. But there's no indication that the male-like females themselves are aggressive. In other words, the females are mimicking males' competitive ability, very much in the same way that, say, non-venomous snakes mimic venomous snakes, or non-toxic butterflies mimic toxic butterflies. But in this case, instead of talking about venom or toxins, we're talking about competitive ability and aggression, which kind of makes sense when you think about hummingbirds. Again, I showed you that video of just these really aggressive hummingbirds, and many of you have likely seen hummingbirds chasing each other at feeders. Hummingbirds, a really big part of their life is aggression and dealing with aggression from other birds. So makes sense for them to sort of pay attention to the coloration of who is being more aggressive and who is not. Okay, so just to recap some of the findings here. Jacobin females come in two morphs, an ornamented male-like type and a drab type. The ontogeny of plumage color and male mate preference both indicate sexual selection cannot explain female ornamentation. And instead, ornamentation in females is most likely used in competition with both conspecifics and heterospecifics, same species and different species, to gain access to food. This is more likely a case of male mimicry than one in which male-like females are themselves more aggressive than other females. We've also considered other hypotheses that I haven't been able to talk about today, but I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards. And it looks like I'm actually running great on time, so feel free to ask me about that. Okay, so in addition to what I've found in the past, I'm really excited about the questions that I haven't been able to answer yet. There are so many of these questions, but here are just a few I'm especially intrigued by. First, why does the polymorphism persist? Why do you still see both the male-like and the drab female types together in this population? So far, I've shown very few disadvantages to being male-like. So why exactly is this plumage type still the minority? And why don't all the females just look male-like if there's so many advantages to it? Second, what is the role of heterospecific behavior in the evolution of female plumage? When multiple species share an overlapping resource like nectar, I don't think we can simply draw an arbitrary line at the species level if we want to think about resource competition. This is especially important in species-rich regions like the tropics, where niche space between species can overlap a lot. Lastly, what is the mechanism, genetic or otherwise, that express ornamentation? So in this presentation, I talked pretty much all about why this variation exists from an evolutionary or an adaptive standpoint. But one of the things I really hope to study in the future is the types of mechanisms that allow for different types of morphs to exist in the population. So basically, can variation in females and also basically, I think that this system would be great for asking whether variation in females can give hints to how variation between sexes evolved with a shared genome. Okay, so I personally think this species and hummingbirds in general are fascinating when it comes to understanding social selection, and in turn, the evolution of variation between and within sexes. They compete intensely for multiple types of resources, not just mates, and not just within their own species. And like the female Jacobins, the result, I think, is unique and unexpected phenotypic evolution. Okay, so I'll finish up. I have lots of people to thank, but especially my former field assistants, funding sources, and lots of technical support. If you're interested in this study, some, not all of what I talked about today was just published. I think it's still open access for a bit, but if not, feel free to get in touch and I can send you a copy. Thank you all again, and I'm happy to take questions. It looks like I'm way ahead of time. I'm usually way over time, and I think I went overkill on making this short. But yeah, if there are any questions, I'm happy to discuss any of this. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. It was an incredible talk and very enlightening research. Honestly, I was fascinated with all the different approaches you took to answer these questions. There are indeed several questions. I have a few of my own.
Awesome.
So let's start. So Victor has this question. Well, thanks for the amazing lecture. Do you think environment affects the development of male-like plumage, or it is a genetically fixed characteristic?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm attempting to write grant proposals to ask this right now. It's very difficult for me because I'm very, throughout my PhD, I was very much focused on sort of like thinking about evolution from a theoretical standpoint and not looking at like specific genetic mutations. But basically, we know that there's some plasticity, right? We know that there's some ability to switch between the juvenile period to the adult period. But I never recaptured an adult that shifted. So from year to year. So that to me indicates that there's probably, it's somewhat fixed, that there's a genetic component to this. But it's possible that it is still entirely developmental and there's some sort of threshold developmental point as a juvenile that basically makes you go one way or another for the rest of your life. Either of those are possible, and I'm not sure which one at this point.
Okay, thanks, Jay. There's a couple of questions. Natalia says, I want to ask, do you think this pattern of aggressive interactions towards drab females varies depending on the time of the year? For instance, during reproductive season?
Yeah, so I did all of these tests during the reproductive season. And we were seeing simultaneously courtship and copulation and aggression at the same time, which is kind of what it's kind of in line with what you see in the field too. You see both aggression and courtship towards females. Now, during the non-reproductive season, Jacobins become much less common, at least in Gamboa. We're not really sure why that is, if they're just being more discreet, or maybe they might have some sort of altitudinal migration that we don't know about. Basically, during the non-reproductive season, it gets hard to study them. But I think that this is a fascinating question. I have always wanted to redo all those mount experiments that I did during the non-reproductive season to specifically ask this question, and also to see basically when Jacobins are not very present in the environment, do you see the same results? When birds aren't being constantly harassed by these male white-necked Jacobins, maybe other species stop paying attention to that signal. So yeah, I think it's a fascinating question, and I don't quite know the answer yet.
Thanks. Juan Andres says, is it possible that the differences in plumage and behavior in females is due to a specific hormone that tends to be higher in males?
Yeah, again, I love all these questions because they're the exact questions that I love thinking about myself. But yeah, all of them, I have the very unfortunate and frustrating answer that I don't know yet. So hormones specifically in hummingbirds are historically very difficult to study. And we don't actually know. So, in some birds, we know that testosterone is what dictates whether you have a sort of male-like plumage or a female-like plumage. And in other bird species, it seems to not be the amount of testosterone, but it seems to be the presence or lack of estrogen. But in hummingbirds, we don't know yet. And probably the biggest reason is because measuring the amount of hormones in the bloodstream of a hummingbird is very difficult. When I started my PhD, I wanted to look at this, right? But I soon found out I basically had to take a little bit more blood than I was comfortable with taking in order to get these measurements. But over the years, I think that that amount has actually reduced. And so I think you can actually now look at a bunch of different hormones with very little amount of blood. So I think that, yeah, there's actually another person looking at this potentially in another species, not white-necked Jacobins, but another species that has two different types of females. And so hopefully we'll know something at least in another species pretty soon.
Great. There's a couple more questions. I'll wait for one that I want to also ask. Daniel says, I'm not sure if I understand. Are there changes in female song frequencies when there is competition compared to mating times?
Right. So I think that if I'm understanding correctly, the question is about whether the frequency of song changes throughout the year. So there's different ways that I can answer this. First of all, I know less about what's happening during the non-breeding season because, again, I think that Jacobins largely leave the field sites that I work at. But from what I can tell, males and females have slightly different call frequencies. I think that males do have more vocalizations than females. And they also have specific vocalizations that the females don't use. A lot of people ask whether the male-like females call more similarly or have vocalizations that are more similar to the males. And again, that's something that I don't know at this point, because the only way that I can know whether something that looks like a male is actually a male is either by genetically sexing them or using that electronic tag system. So just looking at a male, and if I hear something that looks like a male sing, I don't know with 100% certainty whether that's a male or a female. But given that the drab females do something different, and physiologically, I've found no differences between the female types. My guess is that they are also different from the males, but I just don't know that yet.
Okay,
hopefully that answers that question.
There's two more questions for now. Juliana asks, do you think that frequency-dependent selection might explain this polymorphism? And have you observed that more challenging environments have a higher proportion of male-like females?
Right. Okay. So yes, great question. The question is whether frequency-dependent selection might explain the polymorphism. And for those who might not be familiar with that term, basically frequency-dependent selection is when the fitness of an individual changes depending on how common its trait is in that social environment. And so, in short, I suspect that this is something to do with frequency-dependent selection. And you can really picture this when you think about this as mimicry. So we know with mimicry, as you have a situation. We can imagine this as, since I have time, I'll go into this in detail. We have these drab females. We know they're less aggressive. And we have the males that are ornamented and they are more aggressive. And then we have the male-like females who are ornamented but not as aggressive. So a rare male-like female, if there are no other male-like females, she's going to get away with accessing flowers and nectar resources pretty easily because everyone else that looks like her, the males, are super aggressive, right? But as we increase her morph frequency, we see more and more male-like females in the environment. Basically, the effect of that the connection between the visual signal of looking like a male and aggression is deteriorating because fewer and fewer, you have basically more of these females that aren't aggressive but have the ornamentation. So that signal attachment is deteriorating as you increase the number of male-like females. And therefore, the benefit to looking like a male-like female is decreasing simultaneously. So that would be frequency dependent. That would be what we would call negative frequency dependence. And so I think that's exactly what's happening here. It's something that happens with most types of Batesian mimicry, and I think it's what's happening probably here. But I think that there's basically all the indications show that that's probably what's going on right now, but I think there's a lot more tests that we can do to verify.
Great. There's one last question here in the... So Maria Paula says, do you know anything regarding offspring survival of both male-like and drab females?
Nothing. For some reason, hummingbird nests are really hard to find just because they're very tiny. For some reason, white-necked Jacobin nests are even harder to find. I talked with some local birders and field ornithologists who are really, really great at finding bird nests, and they've found hummingbird nests before, a lot of them, and they say that it's extremely difficult to find white-necked Jacobin nests, which is interesting because basically, like you saw in that video that I showed, they're basically just like a little nest, like plopped down on a big leaf. And so maybe it's just that there's so many leaves around, it's hard to like find a way to look for them. But basically, I think if I want to answer this question, I'm going to need to use some high-tech stuff. This is another thing that I have a grant proposal in the works for. I basically want to use these very new, tiny radio tags. So the tags that I used in this experiment are passive tags. So they last forever under the skin of the bird, and they never need to be charged or anything, but you can only detect them when they go to one of these feeders with an antenna on them. Whereas the radio tags that I want to use basically are pinging constantly. So I can use an antenna to basically follow them. So I would put one on a female and then be able to follow her, ideally, to her nest. And then hopefully have enough of those to be able to gauge survival of the two types. But I think that's, a question that's very important and one that will take a long time to answer no matter what. But yeah, very important.
Jay, so I have a couple of questions. It's been fascinating, and there's so many more questions that have risen from the whole research. I don't know if I didn't get it, but or maybe you didn't mention it. Would you expect like a very strong difference in the resources limiting reproductive success for males and females? I'm trying to think why this whole scenario is happening. In many species, males will invest much less and then will not compete so strong for resources. But how do you picture this whole scenario?
Yeah, so I mean, so on average, we know that males and females have to have equal reproductive success on average, right? But we don't know in terms of variation in these females. And I think that the variation in reproductive success has historically been associated with increased variation in males. And I think that it is a possibility in this case that variation in reproductive success in the females might also be associated with the fact that you find this repeatedly in hummingbirds. So that's sort of the short answer to that. And the reason I think that this might be important for hummingbirds is because we know that predation for hummingbird nests, for the species that we do have predation data for, survival is really low. Like one of the species that a colleague of mine studied, forget this, it was the little hermit, one of the Phaethornis species. He was finding 90% nest failure. And so that kind of thing is what you find in males with extremely high sexual selection and like a lot of ornamentation. That kind of variation where a few individuals might be accounting for a lot of the next generation. I'm very curious if that same sort of thing is happening with females because predation is so high and the ability to kind of get resources for your offspring quickly and efficiently may be super important. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
more or less, yes. And building on that, do you know anything around paternal investment? How much do males invest in taking care of the nest and or bringing food back?
Yeah, so this is something that I should have emphasized more, but in hummingbirds, they're different from most birds, actually. In hummingbirds, males do no parental care. There's been, out of the 300 plus species, we know of no species where males take care of offspring. They don't take care of the offspring. They don't build nests, nothing.
Okay.
And so, yeah, that's why when we see one of these individuals that look like a male on a nest, we're pretty confident that that's actually a female and not a male.
Yeah. And my last question is very, very technical. You mentioned something about some high quality sugar and low quality sugar feeders. How do I don't know how do you think hummingbirds are starting to identify this?
Yeah, so high quality and low quality in my experiment was just the amount of sugar. So
Yes.
high was I did a by volume 1 part sugar to 3 parts water is the high, and it's 1 part sugar to 6 parts water for low. So basically half the amount of sugar in the low quality. And so in terms of how do they assess that? I did that proportion because it's roughly about what you see in flowers in nature. It's hard to know whether, how closely this mimics what they're seeing in the wild. Because of course, in the wild, we made these feeders basically infinite food resources for them, right? So even a low quality feeder is still a lot of sugar compared to what they're going to find from a single flower in the wild. And so that's potentially why we saw no difference between the males and the females in terms of their preference for these two types. But again, we did see more preference for the high quality ones. I think that I think they are able to detect the differences just because they're nectar feeders and they're used to this kind of thing. But I also gave no color indication. The location was randomized. So they had to figure that out for themselves. Whereas in the wild, they're going to have color and shape and location indications for where they might find good versus bad resources. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect. Jane, so thanks very much for this great talk. It was really, really interesting to see the whole system and the way you have addressed the questions, the hypotheses, and the expected results and whatever came out. It was a very easy to follow talk and very interesting topic. So in the name of everyone here in the audience, thanks, and we hope to have you back a couple of years from now with some other answers and of course questions to see how the whole system is.
Hopefully. I hope so too. Yeah, really, again, thank you so much for inviting me. If I do present again, hopefully I can do it in Spanish next time. That's my
sure. That would be great. Bueno, pues gracias a todos y a todas por estar con nosotros hoy en el seminario con Falk, y los esperamos en 8 días para el siguiente seminario. Entonces, muchas gracias y feliz tarde para todos y para todas.